Hello friends, for today's video we're going to be looking at episodes 7 through 12 of Vinland Saga. Kicking it off, we see that Askeladd and his men end up allying themselves temporarily with somebody who is trying to get into this very fortified area. And Thorfinn within this time is the one that is forced to go speak on behalf of Askeladd. It is established that through the years, he not only is being held to this idea of you can prove yourself and then I will reward you with a duel. While this is continuing, you are also seeing the way that Askeladd uses him. Very much we are seeing after all the emotional things that occurred within the first batch of episodes, here we are now where Thorfinn is just caught up and consumed so much within the action, and he almost doesn't even seem to realize or acknowledge this because it still is just an extension of his goal. What I find kind of interesting is that this is actually where the manga starts. I find that yes, it does establish how clever Askeladd is, how willing he is to deceive people that he is supposed to be allied with, how lacking in honor he is. This is just another tick in that column of all of the traits that we see from Askeladd, so it reaffirms those things. But I do think it's kind of funny that this is where the manga starts, because the show, it really settles you into the emotional stuff first, and then it orients you into the present by going to this moment. I think it's up for debate which one is better. One of the parts I do really like, though, there's a couple, it's kind of funny in a very morbid way. You do see that Askeladd tells Thorfinn that if he brings him the head of a helmeted man, that he will reward him with a duel. And when the person's head gets cut off by Thorfinn, it falls into the water, and so he immediately jumps after it. Like I said, kind of morbidly funny, but it is somewhat amusing that he's like, oh no. I also, not morbidly funny, this is just another emotional thing that I quite like, is when they take his daggers from him when he goes to speak on Askeladd's behalf. At the very end of the exchange, he tells them, return my dagger to me, it's a memento of my father. Still, that is just the thing that he is so locked into. And also, I noted that the very despicable person who is trying to break into this fortified area that gets hoodwinked out of his riches by Askeladd, well, that is somewhat satisfying. You're also like, yeah, except for Askeladd's also not a very good guy either. But when this person is talking about, I think he specifically says, in the name of Jesus Christ, as he is doing these certain acts. I just wrote in my notes, sure. I also recall in Mark when Jesus was like, make sure you slaughter all these people within this village that you're trying to conquer for their wealth. I'm just like, yeah, that's definitely there. But I do think it's important to have these little statements made throughout this story, as something I noted within the first batch of episodes is when you're going to have a historical fiction story, I do think it's important to include things that are real to history. This is coupled within Vinland Saga with the saga mindset of having these larger-than-life characters. The violence is really over the top, and it is very much exaggerated in certain places because it is kind of pulling from a certain form of storytelling. But you still need that coupled with kind of really making sure somebody is firmly within that time period with these more hard-hitting, hard-to-take-in, raw realities, which is that in this time, as is the case throughout basically all of human history, people will use anything to their advantage to try and sway other people or to hold positions of power. And so while you have this very, and to speak of obviously another exaggerated thing, this very over-the-top character who is just drawn in a way, voiced in a way, in something that just kind of evokes disgust in you. He is simultaneously bringing in this idea of righteousness in his decisions, and the stark contrast of that is so unsettling, but so is everybody in this. And it's kind of interesting because Askeladd, I'm not necessarily proud to say this or anything, but there is a part of him that's compelling and interesting. He's also drawn in a way that isn't so over the top like you see from that other character. So you find yourself wanting to know more about him. But then when you sit and think about his actions, you're like, his actions are terrible. But there's something, and I think this is true of a lot of just human nature. Askeladd is deceitful, but he often is deceiving additional awful people. He does terrible things to innocent people, so it's not like he's Robin Hood or anything where it's like, no, he's actually a man of the people, he's good. He's not good. But there's something about when he deceives the other people that is like kind of satisfying, and even though it's deceit against those people, so it feels less terrible than these other individuals who are just so blatantly trying to act as though they are, again, to use this word, righteous. Because I think that's what makes Askeladd compelling. He seems very aware of his lack of integrity and that he has fully embraced it, which is something that I think is very notable about the next episode. So within this section, he ends up awarding the duel to Thorfinn, as Thorfinn did fetch the head of that one person. He recognizes that he is in trouble. Thorfinn has progressed over the years, and it's only through emotionally manipulating him that he is able to really win. And again, he doesn't care about doing this. Whereas Thorfinn, when he thinks about what it means to be a warrior, what it means to be a slave, you do see that he thinks in his mind that he's not like this woman that you see as a slave for this person that Askeladd interacts with. So to recap, in case you need a refresher as to what's going on besides just the duel, Askeladd comes back to this area to a very warm welcome by a lot of people. He brings them riches, and then he's speaking to what I'm going to call an accountant. So this accountant is kind of going through the funds, and he's like, hey, I'll pay you, just make sure that my men are fed and that we have what we want and we're good to go. And the man is like, that sounds great. And then he has this slave who he is constantly being terrible to. And there's a phenomenal quote that is also very devastating. It's specifically when this man is beating the slave. And Askeladd says, a man enslaved by money, whipping a slave he bought so he could act like a master. And it's just this play on what it means to be powerful, what it means to be beholden to someone or something, and this way that you look at their roles. Obviously, this woman in this moment is the one who would have the label of slave, and yet it's the man that you see Askeladd calling a slave. And so there's this like hint of something interesting about his character, and there's something where he is able to look around him and see the world for what it is, and he's almost like the perfect person to be a villain to Thorfinn, because Askeladd is somebody who in a way is quote-unquote free, but not in a good way, because he doesn't hold himself to any principles necessarily, but not in the same way that you see from other people. He doesn't really seem to care that much about a lot of things, or even all the riches that he possesses. He doesn't seem like he's that infatuated with anything in particular. So you're constantly wondering, like, what is his purpose? Which I think is why you find yourself being drawn into him. And the reason I'm saying it makes him feel like a great antagonist to Thorfinn specifically is that Thorfinn is somebody who, and getting back to the conversation he has with the woman who's enslaved when she brings him food, he tells her something along the lines, he paraphrases a little bit, because she's like, oh, are you a slave too? And he's like, no. And she's like, oh, I thought maybe you were. And he's like, why would I care what you think? Which he's being terrible in this moment. But he tells her that if he were in her position, he would kill his captors and run away. There is something very tragic, one, about her situation, because she should never, nobody should be in a position that she is in. But also, there is a great irony in realizing, Thorfinn, you could technically do that. Do you think that she should ask her master to have a battle in a duel that's honorable? Or are you essentially telling her you would kill her master? If you were her, you would kill him and anybody that stood in your way, and you would run. But that has been an option for you, and you have never partook in that, even though you could have many times, because you hold yourself to this warped idea of what it means to be honorable, and to somebody who honor means nothing. So there is this juxtaposition between these two characters where both of them end up committing terrible acts because Thorfinn's not innocent. As much as he holds to this idea, he is still right there along Askeladd and Askeladd's men for years, killing people that don't need to be killed, partaking in violent acts, and he is telling himself it's all so that he can pursue this honorable, noble thing. And then Askeladd's just doing whatever he wants because there's nothing holding him to any set of principles, yet they both are partaking in the same acts. That's why I feel like these characters are interesting, because it's so easy to be like, oh, but Thorfinn went through something sad and he just wants to avenge his father. And this is why I always feel like Vinland Saga is a great example of a revenge story, because it does do so many interesting things with the revenge story, and then it takes the typical things and it digs really deep and it adds all these additional layers to them. And this is in part because it really truly does have a very phenomenal antagonist. Episode 9 is the Battle of London Bridge. This one is much more, once again, action oriented, and personally, in my opinion, I like the action in this more than the action in episode 7. I like this exaggerated figure a lot more than what we saw in episode 7. And also, I kind of like Floki trying to be like, join our side, and Thorkel being like, no, and just throwing rocks at this guy. That is a little bit satisfying. The action is in typical fashion for this story, really, really over the top. When you see Thorfinn stab Thorkel's hand, and then he just gets tossed back and forth, it is very extreme. Thorfinn is willing to endure this, and then his dislocated shoulder, he pops it back into place, and then he follows along with Askeladd's men. I do think that this is sort of setting the scene for other characters and bigger picture things. You're introduced to Ragnar and Canute, and you are seeing all these other pieces that are a little bit outside of Thorfinn's story. So in a way, these episodes don't have the same emotional impact to some degree that we saw from the first batch, but they are setting the scene for something bigger. And I will add, they are once again adding to what makes Askeladd compelling. The best quote from episode 9 for me is when Thorkel is somebody who is just like, bye, we should do this again sometime, and everybody just seems to be captivated by war, or people seem like they want to keep fighting, and nobody ever seems to want to stop. And Thorfinn specifically thinks, what the hell is so entertaining about war? And I wrote that quote in my notes, and I'm also just thinking like, then stop. It's what you continuously find yourself feeling and thinking, or at least I do, when engaging with this story, is like, stop. You hate this. You hate it. You don't have to keep doing it. I think my favorite episode of this batch is this next one, episode 10, although I did like episode 8 quite a bit, the even numbers. But episode 10 is called Ragnarok, and you do see the scene where Thorfinn is just kind of in a very moody way looking out at this beautiful area among these ruins. And he is and has been picturing his father. In episode 8, when he was on the ship, he pictured his father, and his father was trying to reiterate again, you have no enemies, no one has enemies. And he's just cold and curled up, and he imagines himself as a boy once again in that moment. And then when he has a memory that is somewhat actually just an imagining of something that could be, he once again sees himself as a boy, and his father is this big, strong figure, and his mother and his sister are as he remembers them to be. He sees this beautiful land, Vinland. He sees this place where it's warm and sprawling, but very quickly he is seeing these ships come in, and his father is telling him, you know you have to protect them, right? You need to protect your mother and your sister. There's so much about this that, oh man, I just want Thorfinn to really reflect at the idea that all these places that you have been going to, and all of the battles and all the bloodshed, it could so easily be the very place that your mother and sister are. And he even notes, he thinks, that's not where I'm from. That wasn't Iceland. Iceland would be covered in snow at this point. And it's like, yeah, you could go. This group of people will go anywhere, and they'll take anything, and that includes people. I do really love the way that he is sort of reflecting, and then he just shuts it down. I don't love it from a standpoint of I want the characters to just be happy and okay, but from a storytelling standpoint, I think it's important to have these moments. But after having this dream, he looks out at this area, and then Askeladd comes and talks to him. And Askeladd starts telling him, it's always going to be this way. It's kind of nihilistic. It's very much like, it's always going to be like this. First, there were the Romans, and then the Saxons, and then there's us, and there will always be somebody else after. It's interesting because it does say a lot about Askeladd's character, and the fact that I think he's somebody who is very much thinking, I'm just going to partake in life because there's things outside my control, so I'm going to do what I can, when I want. And Thorfinn is very different in a lot of ways from that. He has one single focus, even though he has the opportunity to do those very same things and to not pursue this life of violence. He had the guidance from his father to turn away from that. I just love this interaction between these two characters. But then once again, you see that somebody comes and violence comes calling for Askeladd in a way that feels different than before. He seems very set on something, so you do wonder, what's going on with him. Why does he seem so concerned with Canute? And why, if he has the opportunity to go elsewhere? And even Bjorn notes, like, you seem very different. And Askeladd's kind of just like, whatever. And that leads us into episodes 11 and 12, which I would say are pretty tied together, as this is when you do see more of what's going on with Canute and Thorkel and Askeladd and how all of these paths are coming together. And Thorfinn, of course, is just sort of caught in all of it. And you do see he goes on this rescue mission basically to pull Ragnar and Canute from the fire and bring them over to where Askeladd is. There is a conversation that occurs between Thorkel and Thorfinn about his father and the fact that he even knew who his mother was. Your father was this great warrior. The word warrior is used a number of times, and there is a part where Ragnar's men, after they have come to rescue Ragnar and Canute, they start to go back, and Thorkel is saying, okay, well, now that you have Canute, then we have no reason to hold back. And the men could easily retreat, and Ragnar is trying to get them to go back, and they're like, but we have to fight now, otherwise we're cowards, and a warrior wouldn't turn around. And you're just like, oh my gosh, the way that people get so caught up in these labels and these words that ultimately mean nothing, and they'll throw their lives away, and they'll continue to kill other people because of an idea. And you're like, what are you doing? Not a noble idea, not to defend people or protect people, but just because it might mean they're cowardly. And you're just like, oh, the way that they're just all so attached. And I think it's notable that they use the word warrior because that's what Thorfinn does as well. He sort of justifies his actions or rationalizes his decisions by wrapping it around this word that ultimately doesn't mean much, and it means something different to different people. Then you see, as I said, Thorkel sort of has this rescue with Canute, and then Canute and his men are now being taken to some allies of Askeladd's. I think one of the most almost heartbreaking, if you want to call it that, moments of this entire section is when the monk is being questioned and made fun of. They're like, oh, does the king have all these beautiful women and all these riches? And he's like, he doesn't really have anything I want or what I'm in search of. And they're like, what are you in search of? And he says, love. And they laugh and they're like, I don't know what love is. And he tries to explain it. And they're like, this is just some magic religious word that means nothing. And they pretty much shut him out and don't seem to care. And then there is another person that looks at him and says, monk, keep going, keep talking. And it's just so strange to imagine, I think, a place and a time when the concept of love didn't have a word attached to it. You also see that Leif is continuing to look for Thorfinn. You get a brief moment where he sees a boy and he thinks maybe it's Thorfinn and it's not. And then you also see that Askeladd and his men have been ambushed, and that is where this batch leaves off. As I said a few times throughout the chat, I do think that this section is leading into something bigger. It is also showcasing a little bit more of Askeladd, and it is starting to bring you into this more historical fiction setting outside of just Thorfinn and how it relates to him. As a result, I do feel like this is a little less touching and moving than the first 6 episodes, but it is important for things moving forward. That's it though for a chat for episodes 7 through 12. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you later. Bye.